First time I remember Henry Cecil and his brother, where they were sort of about 1920, and in a sense, two more useless sons of the gentry you could possibly find. They were involved with the racing scene via their stepfather at Newmarket. But Henry wouldn't show that much interest, just they were pushed around doing studs and things. He then eventually became assistant to his much, much older stepfather. And unlike, you look at the stories of John Gosden or Michael Stout or Aidan O'Brien, they were always very sharp on things. I mean, there was no signs of Henry before then, but once he became assistant, he definitely was showing an interest, even though he was still crashing cars and taking quite a lot of drink and stuff. But then he married Julie Merlis, who was the royal trainer, who actually trained at Warren Place. So he was perfectly set up. It sounds silver spoon, but he actually had to get grafting. And what was fascinating to me is that all the way along, there was a suggestion that, from lots of people, not just me, but the impression you got is that Henry was sort of floating about and to some extent just getting lucky. Obviously getting lucky that he had a stepfather like that and father-in-law. And then Julie was very outgoing, and Noel Merlis's daughter. Paddy Rudkin, the head lad, was a very much sort of down-to-earth, blacksmith's son. And we thought they, to some extent, carried Henry. But exploring this book, it was clear he was going to his drum, but it's in his own way. And there's a very revealing line from Paddy Rudkin, who said to me one evening when they were in the first sort of 4 or 5 years, they were feeding up in the sort of 5 o'clock. He said that, the governor's been hanging around all afternoon, he hadn't done anything. But actually he'd been wandering around the boxes, just sort of looking at the horses, practically sniffing them. And if there's one thing, because the enigma of what does Henry Cecil actually bring to the party is, no one quite knows that, is that he got to know his horses better than anything else. It's impossible to overestimate how long a shadow he cast at that time. I'm not saying he ran the shop, but he was the biggest figure around, and everyone was sort of in awe of him. And he came back, been at Vincent O'Brien's, and he was in his late 40s really, but it gave him a new energy, and he became champion jockey again from there. And of course this mixture of the foppish looking Cecil and the graveyard looking Leicester was a wonderful pair, and they were a match. At those years of zenith at Warren Place, they were, at one stage, Henry's team, they had a 40% strike rate, and they didn't run them. Basically, they said, well, they win to a huge extent, and they did win. It was just extraordinary dominance of that period, and of course it didn't last, as nothing ever lasts. And the extraordinary thing and the heroic thing about the Cecil team is that he has come back in the game when, as you know, most people had counted him out. Oh So Sharp was actually quite a feisty mare straight away, and of course that was a Sheikh Mohammed too. So Sheikh Mohammed came in on the act. She was a Triple Crown winner in the fact that she won the Guineas, Oaks and St Leger. And funnily enough, I went over to Kentucky and stayed with Steve Cawthon, and he said unequivocally that rode some great fillies, but Oh So Sharp was the best of them.
Well, Henry's a great trainer, no question, and but Julie was great too. She was like the glue that kept everybody together, and we had a great stable staff. We had great owners. We had Lord Howard de Walden, and Louis Friedman, and many others. Obviously, Sheikh Mohammed was in the yard at the time, and we had others, and it was just a great yard. We had Henry. The few horses that he bought, he picked. He was obviously a good judge. He bought some nice horses, but we were getting sent some very, very nice horses every year from those owners, and it was just a lot of fun.
The Steve Cawthon years were the absolute zenith of Henry Cecil's training career. I've no doubt about that, and all the people around it, and it was an unbelievably happy ship. The time, sort of Julie riding up the head of the string, Paddy riding out as well, Steve Cawthon would be riding out, and then Henry would be chatting along through, and there'd be a lot of Willie Jardine who's the assistant, and there'd be a lot of big players with input. So again, it's understanding horses and having wonderful horses too coming through. And Steve and Slip Anchor, Steve and Reference Point. I mean, the ride Steve gave Reference Point and Slip Anchor, and they were front-running rides both, and they were contrasting front-running rides, were quite magnificent. And luckily, I had detailed them at the time, so it was very nice to go back over them. Because actually, if you're asking people now what they remember very fractions, and often the memory gets quite muddled through the filter. So I'm confident the pictures I'm painting are the pictures of the time as much as recollections from here.
And Slip Anchor has never been headed throughout the race. Slip Anchor winning the Derby from, in second place, Law Society.
Henry sort of upset about something in the book, but you can't actually deal with a portrait of him and his highs unless you detail to an extent the lows, though anyone who reads the book who thinks that somehow this is going to be great revelations, this is a wholly sympathetic, but it is a realistic book. And of course, when Natalie joined him and Julie left, so did quite a lot of other lads. The whole system changed a bit, and not everybody liked it, and that's not my opinion, this is what happened. And in the end, Sheikh Mohammed left too, and it was very tough, and not for the last time. A lot of people thought that would be the end of Henry, but it wasn't. And of course the Abdullah team came on board more, various other people, and of course the Wafik side with Bosra Sham and Co came on, and there were a whole string more Derby winners and Classic winners.
Looking for a way through now. Sasuru sitting on the outside, 2 lengths away then as Allied Forces as heads are turned for home inside the 3. Benny the Dip on the far side being tackled now by Pilsudski the near side. They've kicked away 2 lengths to Bosra Sham, who's angling to get out now. She's got plenty of room, followed then by Sasuru.
Henry Cecil's been extremely good at not screaming and shouting on the day. You know, there may have been some words afterwards, but not on the day. But he did that day. It was all got too tense, and he didn't say it that day. The next day, he said you all saw what happened and everything. And I mean, the fact is, it's a striker misses a goal. It happens, and it always will happen. But so he came, and then it was announced that he wasn't going to ride Bosra Sham again, and everyone was going to fight for cross, and would he keep his job, and all that type of stuff. And he came to Newmarket and rode 4 winners, and then he rode 7 winners at the meeting. And I mean, it did actually shut everybody up. There are absolutely no good parts of being the subject of a tabloid sting, and that's what happened to Henry and indeed Fallon. They ring you up on the Saturday evening and saying, have you got a comment for this story? And you know, then they're going to print it anyway and all that sort of stuff. And that happened, and again, I'm afraid it became so central to the story you can't not handle it. I hope I've handled it sympathetically, but it's there. You can't pretend it didn't happen. It did happen. And that was all very upsetting and all the rest of it. But things were going wrong for not only for Henry's marriage, things were going wrong in the yard. It was not sufficient as it was. More key staff had left. And Henry Cecil's tanker lost way from 99 onwards. It was losing way, and then it lost way and then it very nearly keeled over and sank. And they built out of it. And of course the wonderful thing is that the 2 key players stayed with them, albeit with fewer horses, with the Niarchos team and the Abdullah team. And those people, crucially, the sort of horses they send you aren't just ordinary yearlings. They could win a classic, as indeed they did.
Frankel now in full cry, Celebration and Immortal Verse. 2 quality horses are made to look mere mortals as Frankel remains unbeaten and wins the QE2.
Certainly a version of the story is that the horse, even though he'd been perfectly right as a yearling over in Ferren Stud in Ireland, when he began to get going with a wide open expanse of Newmarket, he was a bit like a 15-year-old gets onto whiskey, and a couple of times he went all over the place. And one morning when he'd finished, he came in, and Mike Marshall, who's very experienced, was a very good jockey too, came into the box with Dan DeHaan, and he said to Dan, you know, I'm not sure we're going to make it with this one. So what do you do? And this is the fact of the matter, which is what you do actually is you cut them. So the facts are that Frankel wasn't that far from being castrated. Pity he wasn't, because he'd be still running now. He'd be running in everything, Melbourne Cup and goodness knows what. But then Dan rode him one morning on the Alberhaffy by himself, because he wouldn't dare put him there because he was pulling so hard, but they had some other bridle on him, Joss remember then. And he was just worried about holding him. And when he got to the end, Mike said, how'd you get on? He said, I tell you what, because this is an absolute monster. And then when they first worked it, it left something for dead. The achievement by that team to get the horse right through a 4-year-old career, a horse who after all started off as a pretty fiery 2-year-old, and then what wasn't said much, well, it wasn't said at all publicly, when he was a 3-year-old, that he was very difficult. He used to kick the box down and he would throw his things around. And by the time he got to Ascot as a 4-year-old, Henry was suddenly opening up about that. Because I've written some several things for the Racing Post, but didn't mention that, even though I knew it, because it wasn't in the public arena. But he was volunteering himself. This horse used to be a bit mad and all the rest of it. But he got much more relaxed. And by the end, if you didn't know anything about him, he was perfectly all right. And by the very last race, I think he was nearly too switched off. Very noticeable in that last race at Ascot. When he jumped out of the stalls, he didn't jump.
10 furlongs, they're off and racing. Frankel slow away. Has dwelt and just required pushing into the bridle for the early stages.
Tom Quilly, normally, well, the horse that he had been as a 3-year-old, if he hadn't jumped, missed the stalls the way he did, you'd be delighted because you'd be able to drop your hands on him. He wouldn't pull. Tom Quilly didn't do that at all. What he did is for 3 strides, he went push, push, push. Now that means that the feeling he got was the horse didn't actually want to go. So he's convinced, and I mean, for instance, so is Mike Marshall, that forget just about Frankel, but I mean, all these other wonderful horses. I mean, Midday's half sister is this year. The idea of you get up in the morning and you've got these wonderful horses to go to. It may be stressful training racehorses, but it's the perfect job for someone his sort of illness, because actually you've got to get up in the morning. When you get up in the morning, there's something to lift the spirit. And I say, I think I say it in the book, but I mean it very sincerely, I'm absolutely convinced that Henry is a man who doesn't just live for his work, he's only alive because of his work.